All right, welcome to this week's episode of the Shotmaker podcast. I'm really excited. I think I'm more excited than Scott is. But I'm really excited to talk about Charlie Wood's generation in golf. It was a big weekend a couple weekends ago, which was the PNC Championship, which you may not know, but this is the one time a year where the top golfers play with their either children or with their parents. You have some Justin Thomas plays with his dad. You have Nelly Corda plays with her dad. So, but then you also have an introduction to the next generation.
Very cool.
Annika played with her son, who's 11. Tiger played with Charlie.
So that might be the big one.
That might be the big deal. But what's interesting, especially taking a step back as sports fans and ultimately, business people have this decision too, is looking to the next generation. So as a little bit of a backstory, maybe you may not know, but my job in college was actually coaching a high school golf team while I was playing in college. And I coached Bernard Longer's oldest daughter, Jackie. Which was a cool introduction into what it must be like to be a child whose parent is amazing. Bernard Longer's, won records, senior tour, PGA tour, Masters champ. But what was interesting seeing it from Jackie's perspective, which I think we can also really translate to the second generation of a business owner, is her life was just so different, right? To her, watching golf was just that's my dad, right? And what was funny is even though she did not really play golf, she could make every putt because she just was used to watching the best players in the world. So of course to her, every 10-footer goes in, right? Why would it not? But what's also interesting is, her starting point in the sport was very different from, most 15-year-olds, right? She's seen the top level, she's been introduced to it, she's traveled it. So, when I watch the PNC, now being a mom and a business owner, it's interesting to kind of think about that next generation and also how the different athletes have approached it. Because as much as you have Charlie, who clearly spends a ton of time with Tiger, their mannerisms were insanely the same, going to pick their ball up. But then you have others who you could tell their kids don't spend a lot of time with the golfers, right? You have Padraig Harrington, his kids really never took it up. So I think it's something to think about as parents, because I think a lot of times, especially if you're a business owner and you don't want to force anything on your kids, you don't want to say they have to do this because this is what you did. I think you also forget teaching them the why you love the game. And I have to say, I'm really impressed that both Annika and Tiger have actually encouraged their kids to go in, because I think a lot of times as an athlete, you could say it was such a hard road. The odds are against you. There's a lot of pressure. Right? Why would you do it? You don't need to, right? You probably lead a pretty good life without it. But yet, teaching your kids to love what you do, it's an important lesson.
Yeah, no, it's not. It's like you said, whether sports or business, they're gonna follow, what you're doing, and then make their own choice. I think that's right. The important part of what you're saying is it's not forced. It's giving the opportunity that you had if you're a golfer to maybe have them play golf with you. If you own a business, maybe part of that. Yeah. And then see if they like those parts of what you're doing, right?
Right, because I think this is also a really good side tax topic, even though, we may not think about it, is we're allowed to pay our kids in our business as a tax strategy, right? And I think a lot of times as business owners, it's I'll just throw my kids on payroll, make sure it's under the certain limit, it's tax-free. But if we're going to do that anyway, why not get them a little involved, right? Yeah. Show them the business, because I think a lot of times we forget that those are great life lessons.
Oh, I grew up in a family restaurant. And and yes, I was paid, but I worked. I was, and if you laugh, 8, 9 years old, bussing tables every once in a while. Not a 10-hour shift. But I would say by the time I was 13, I was probably working every other Friday night bussing just to be part of it, get in. My dad was there anyway, so basically dropped off, and then I would come home when he left. I think living and breathing that part of it to
Well, because it's a good lesson, and I think a lot of times as business owners, you also have a false sense of protecting your kids. I think especially if you look at Charlie, it doesn't matter, right? No matter where he goes, he is going to be Tiger's son. So, while you could have the argument of, do you want him to have to go out and pave his way in golf and all of that, it doesn't matter. He could be playing water polo. He's still going to be Tiger Woods'
Right.
kid. So I think it's also like accepting the reality of that, and probably similar to a restaurant owner, right? If your son or daughter is bussing tables next to, Joe or Sally, it's always going to be your son or daughter. There's not much you're going to be able to do to change that.
Right.
But the more everyone's just lives with that as the reality, but then still continues to say, okay, well, even though you are Charlie Woods, or even though you are, your son or daughter, here's the expectation, right? You still have to go practice. And to me, that's really impressive with, especially watching Charlie's, you can tell that he practices a lot. He loves the game.
Sure.
Like, he's pushing himself. And I think, he doesn't obviously have to financially, right? He's
Right.
probably okay. But I think that's cool to see that he is pushing himself and working hard.
Right. And everyone has a different mentality. I mean, again, I know working for my dad playing sports when he was a coach, I got the worst. No other kid got yelled at on the team. I would get yelled at on the team. No other bus boy would be back doing dishes or whatever. I was doing dishes. So that was the side of it that didn't matter. Trust me, there people look like, oh yeah, he's hard on you, but it teaches you early on what it's about, whether it's on a golf course or in a restaurant.
And those are great lessons, because again, I think sometimes you're afraid to be harder, but those are great ways to bring in the next generation, bring them in to see what you do, to understand what you do, and then ultimately really think about those transition moments, right? Because I think there will be a time where they have to stand on their own, and are they ready for that pressure?
Well, I think that's what we see sometimes is the people that aren't ready for that, or don't want it, right? I don't think they didn't want it. They're in the spot because they've just gotten paid for whatever their whole life. I don't, and then they're not ready to run the business. Whether it's, again, they don't have the desire to, they don't want to, they don't have the skill set to. Maybe it's just, it wasn't for them. They could work as hard as they want. They were not going to be good at that. And that's, I think, we see some struggles with in the restaurant business of.
Well, and I think it's understanding to the next generation, right? I think you're right. I think the ones that you see that are successful in it have found a way to take what the parent did and make it their own. To say, oh, that's great, like my dad or my mom did this, but now I'm doing this. I think where there's a struggle is like the kids have the unfair burden of you're going to keep it the same.
Right. And I think that's a two-way street, right? Like again, I was the next generation, but my grandparents, great-grandparents were all in the business, right? So it went, and each kind of level expanded, made their own version of that. Whether it's adding banquet rooms or changing the, obviously menus in restaurants, but you have to let that next generation do it differently, because it's not going to probably succeed if you keep doing the same, right? Like how many restaurants? There are probably a few, very few around the country that's what it's going to be forever. But 99% are going to have to evolve.
And I think that's what's so hard, right? And I think you can even see that on, the golf side, but especially in business, is, the teaching the parent to step back, right? Because I'm sure, if you're Tiger, you want to be right there and have your own opinions, but if this is going to work, it's got to be, the next generation leading the charge.
What happens when Charlie once sees a different, I don't know, a different club than Tiger? I mean, I don't know golf like you, but at some point I would assume there's a choice on maybe what to use, and what happens when 3 years from now Charlie is a little better, knows what he's doing, and maybe says, thanks, Dad, but I'm going to do this.
Well, and that's what was so interesting. And I didn't see anything if this was, by design. But every year they showed up, they always wear the same thing, right? And of course, on Sunday, they always wear red, right? Because that's Tiger's color. So, you have pictures of when Charlie was like 10 and 12, and it gets bigger, but they're always in red on Sunday. What was interesting, and again, I don't know if this was by design, but on Sunday, Charlie had a more of like a maroon, or almost like not purple, but kind of purple. Not red. It was definitely not red.
So like a shade.
Yes. And I was like, maybe he's coming up with his own color, which would be so smart, because I think, you need to do something that's a little different. Otherwise, you're always just going to be
completely in the shadow, right? You're just the son of Tiger, where you once eventually be Charlie.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think as we get to the end of the year, as we get into next year, it's a good time to, even if it's 5, 10 years out, just think about the next generation. Because I think the other thing we see is so many times as owners, you think, oh, my kid's not interested. My kid's not interested. Like they're doing their own thing. And then all of a sudden your kids come back and they say they're interested. But they don't know anything about, they don't know what you've done or what your life was like in this place. Whereas if you just bring them in and introduce them a little bit, show them why you love it, because I'm sure there's, some reason that you started this or, created this. And I think them seeing that is such a great place to start.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you.
So, all right. Well, thank you for joining us on this week's episode. And we look forward to seeing you again in 2024.